There are dire warnings that New South Wales will be hit by increasingly extreme weather.
2015 was the hottest year since climate records began.
Your show this July was the single hottest month in recorded history.
Australia sweltered through its hottest spring on record.
Climate change is now affecting every country on every continent.
It's the rate that's of great concern.
And what do you put that rate down to?
Oh, it's human activity.
We have everything we need. Some still doubt that we have the will to act, but I say the will to act is itself a renewable resource.
Hello, and welcome to Climactic, the flagship podcast of the Climactic Collective, the podcast network by and for Australia's climate community. I'm Eve. You might have heard me before. I was the host of Aftermath, and I'm currently the co-host of Serially Curious and the odd episode of Artbreaker. I'm here to introduce today's episode, which comes from a show from the wider community. This episode is from the Feminist Writers' Festival and their new show, FWF Talks. In this episode, called Ecofeminism, Australian Green Senator Lidia Thorpe and novelist Alice Robinson chat with nature writer Inga Simpson about a feminism that centres itself around country. And next week, we're carrying on the climate and feminism topic with an adaptation of a storytelling event by the Women's Climate Justice Collective. But now, please enjoy this FWF Talks episode and find the links to more of their work in the show notes.
Hi, my name is Nikki Anderson and I'm Director of the Feminist Writers' Festival. Welcome to FWF Talks, created for FWF 2020 with the support of the Besen Family Foundation. Check out the whole FWF 2020 program at feministwritersfestival.com. Our think-ins cover the big topics of the day, our culture of violence, inequities in our legal and health systems, and how to stay bold as a feminist and activist. They're virtual events supported by essays to get you thinking about the topics ahead of the festival day on Saturday the 14th of November. But back to FWF Talks. In this episode, Ecofeminism, Green Senator Lidia Thorpe and novelist Alice Robinson chat with nature writer Inga Simpson about a feminism that centres itself around country.
We all owe a lot to the women who paved the way before us. And I think a lot at the moment about Rachel Carson, who took on the big chemical companies, and even though she was dying of cancer and basically spent her last breath on that fight. And Carson was labelled an hysterical woman for suggesting that pumping toxic chemicals into the air and the soil and ultimately the ocean, was going to have some pretty dire consequences. It was hard, even though she was a scientist and a wonderful writer, she was still given that label of hysterical. So here we are with all those consequences of those chemicals into the environment. Has anything changed for women advocating for change today? Is it any easier? What can you tell us about your experience of writing for change, leading for change?
I'm happy to hit it off. No, nothing's changed. It's still a struggle. And, we continue to fight for a seat at the table. And, when we do raise any issues that our community or that we care about, then, the labels come at you. And they're usually negative labels like, troublemaker, wrecker, and, angry Black woman. So it's still a struggle, and it's part of the fight for our voice to be heard. But, just as you say that, so many other staunch women before us have fought for that space, just as my the matriarchs in my family. So you kind of, for me, I've come accustomed to it, that this is part of our struggle, and that we don't do it easy, and that regardless of people trying to put us down or take us down, that we have to maintain that strength and that fight, because at the end of the day, it's about caring for our people, our community, and our planet. So it's still a struggle. I mean, as a Black woman, we still have to deal with the struggles of deaths in custody, removal of children, and incarceration rates. And seeing the destruction of our country is just as devastating as losing a community member. We don't separate ourselves from the land or the water. So the struggle's real, and we've got to stick together and, build this movement together, because I think as women, we are best placed to know what's best for our family and what's best for our community. It's the women that are leading it.
It's such a galvanizing issue, isn't it, for women? Because as you're saying, Lydia, like traditionally women, well, their purview has been the home and their family or their community. And that's where women are sort of situated. And so climate change is an issue that's affecting all of those things so profoundly. I see it as an issue about the way that we're living or our lifestyles and the way in which that's impacting on the environment and how we can change the way that we're living to protect the environment, which is really about what's going on in the home. So communities, and in that sense, I think it's no accident that women are often at the front lines of those fights. But I was also thinking, as you were talking about this question of whether things have changed, and I feel like there's something, the internet gets a terrible rap for being a toxic place, for being problematic in all kinds of ways. But it's also maybe one of the developments that has allowed for women's voices to be so powerful. I'm thinking of Greta Thunberg, of course, and other activists like her who've been able to amplify their voices in a way that might otherwise not have been possible because of the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I've seen in the last couple of years is that with people who are struggling to put food on the table or, just struggling to fight the fight, they all have Facebook. And so our community on Facebook now, and we're more connected than ever through these social media platforms. So the movement is building via social media, which is, it's fantastic.
Ecofeminism made the link between exploitation of women and exploitation of the environment. And I think today we understand that more broadly to the link between inequality and climate change, how we got to where we are. And in the Australian context, I think Judith Wright said back in the 50s, made the link between violence towards our first people, colonisation, and violence towards the land, and she suggested that until we have some sort of reconciliation, that nothing much is going to change in this country. Fast forward 70 years, has anything changed?
Well, for us, it's over 240 years. And to see the destruction and how policies and decisions are made in parliaments, particularly, that continue to oppress Aboriginal people and take away our rights to self-determine our own destiny, is part of this ecological breakdown. Because native title, for example, that's destroyed our people. It's divided our people, and you only have small groups of people making decisions around the destruction of land, and it's usually the women that are at the forefront, questioning our own people's decisions on consent to destroy. I don't think much has changed. I think it's got worse. Where we don't have a say over our land, and that those policies keep us divided and keep us separated. So the last thing the government want is for a unified Aboriginal nation, because we would have a greater voice. And that's what I want to achieve. And I think you talk about reconciliation. I think that we need to go a step further and talk about a treaty and talk about how a treaty can bring peace to this country, the people in this country, and the land and waters of this country.
Do you think there's a discomfort for non-Indigenous Australians about our landscapes, about this country that we live in and on because of this history? Do you think that's one of the reasons we're just still treating it like some kind of colonial outpost, that we're not responsible for?
Yeah. I think, the denial of education in our education system haven't told the true history of this land, and people are confronted by that. People are in denial, and people don't think that they're responsible, and they may not be personally responsible, but if they look back in their family history, I'm sure that there's been some stolen wealth along the lines. And, if we look at my country, for example, so now we just have 7 clans left. So, we need to face up to our history. It's all of our history. No, we may not have been personally responsible, but we have a responsibility to unite this nation in a way where people have a better understanding of what's happened and how we can come together and, be able to celebrate something together in this country. There's nothing that brings us together. And I think a treaty is a mechanism to be able to do that, have those hard conversations. We're at a point now in this country that I think people are ready for some harder conversations.
One of the things I've written about in the past and thought a lot about, and I think it's a problematic assertion in lots of ways, and it's certainly not a unique idea to me, but it's very interesting to me, is whether climate change actually poses for the first time a united front. It's a problem that's going to affect everyone globally and everyone in Australia. And I wonder whether it offers for the first time a kind of conduit for the kinds of conversations and, progression that you're talking about, Lidia, in terms of reconciliation and treaty. It's a catastrophe that we're all facing. And I think the reason that it's very problematic or sort of damaging or complex to say, after 200 years of invasion and colonisation and what we, settler Australians have done to the land, and now we're going to look to Indigenous communities to help us fix the problem. But if that gets everyone at the table to change our culture or change the way we're relating to place and to protect it moving forward, I think it's worth it. I don't know. What do you make of that, Lidia?
I think it's imperative that, truth-telling is not just something that people should be afraid of. It's something that people should embrace, because truth-telling is also sharing stories of how we've maintained and sustained these lands for thousands and thousands of generations. But, the climate space is very white, it's very privileged. They come from a very privileged position. And I think that the climate space needs to decolonise and move over and allow for First Nations voices to be at the table leading a lot of these campaigns. And, I'm not seeing much action around it. There's still very white-run campaigns. And so that automatically creates this kind of us and them when campaigns are being run on country without the proper protocol and consent. If we're not part of the campaign or part of the conversation around what's going to happen, then we'll disengage from that conversation. And so it's a real, it's time for the climate and environment movements to have a good hard look at themselves and ask themselves, do we have consent to run a campaign on that country?
Lidia, Alice and I both, as writers, are writing into this space, in the way that you're talking about too. And I know, Alice, your PhD thesis looked at the issues or the obligations for non-Indigenous writers writing about place or writing about environment. Did you want to talk a bit about that?
My thesis looked at how settler Australians relate to the land and what that might mean for climate change moving forward. And the position I arrived at was that it's very similar to what you're saying, Lydia, that unless we address what's happening, well, what's happened historically with the treaty, unless there's some, meaningful movement in that space, some kind of reconciliation that's really meaningful and probably legal and all those things, then we're just going to keep having settler Australians having this really unsettled relationship to place. I think for example, in my personal history, my dad's lived in the same bit of land for 3 generations, which is the longest of anyone that I know to have lived in one place. And that's nothing. But that's where it's sitting in the settler Australian relationships to place. He's very attached. But of course, that's just a little surface relationship compared to the historic relationships that are there and the ongoing relationships as well. And I think when you're trying to write about all of that, that comes out in the writing, even if you're not trying to address that directly, if you're just trying to describe the landscape or the places that are in the narrative that you're trying to tell. And you can see in Australia, settler Australian writing about place, you can see this kind of attachment and ambivalence about that attachment or fear about those places that is also mixed with the longing and a kind of adoration. Oh, yes, this belonging and longing and fear. And all of this is implicated in the way that we're telling stories about place, the places where we live or are trying to belong. And I think that's really problematic for a culture and for a nation. And I can see those relationships in the way that we're treating our places.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it sounds like we've covered some similar ground. I looked at the history of Australian nature writing and, saw that same discomfort from the outset, this growing attachment to place, to the land and wanting to care for it, and particularly the women writers. Louisa Atkinson, the mid-1800s, called white Australians invaders. Like she used those terms in a newspaper column, invaders, which was pretty radical. But overall, there's just this discomfort with that attachment, and it seems to be getting in the way, and as you say, a longing to belong, but then there's the distance and the overall feeling that, we don't. So, yeah, that was very evident in the history of Australian nature writing as well. And I teach nature writing a lot now, and I'm always having to say to a whole class, if you're going to write about place in this country, you have to acknowledge, the whole history of that place, how you came to be there and what has gone on in that place. But you can sense it, still today. There's a discomfort with going there. So often there's just a dreadful silence,
We don't also know the stories that predate the stories we're trying to tell about those places. Maybe we shouldn't know them, but there's this kind of sense that these places are imbued with history and story and meaning, and we're just skating along the surface, trying desperately to kind of engage or not, just to use those places in ways that, we can see the outcome of in the environment.
Yeah. Lydia, do you have a view for people who are non-Indigenous Australians who are trying to write about place and want to acknowledge traditional custodianship and the history of that place, are the particular protocols that writers should be following, or a place they can go for advice on how to do that if they are uncomfortable in the way that we're talking about?
Well, I think it's about, reaching out to those people who are the custodians of that particular place, and doing it in a, respectful way where it's not onerous on those people, because, we're very few and far between. We're 3% and we're struggling to survive. So, I see the climate catastrophe that we're facing as also in line with the catastrophe that we're facing as First People in this country. Because we're sick and dying, we're incarcerated, and our land is sick and dying and being, it's a form of incarceration of what's going on with our species. And so I often say that, if the worse that climate change gets, the worse our health and well-being gets. So if that goes, well, we're dead. So if you can't keep us alive, then you're not going to keep the land and water alive. So, we don't separate that. But there's also some good examples. And I was thinking while you were talking about when I set up the blockade in Nawanawa in East Gippsland on my country, Gunai country, against Duke Energy, which was the Eastern Gas pipeline that they were putting through from Longford to Sydney. And, I was on the Nawanawa development group, just a little community group in Nawanawa with a local GP, and I was the only blackfella on there, of course. And when we heard about the pipeline coming through, I was in this white space and people were concerned. But then I went out to my elders at Lake Tyers and said, I need to know what the story is of the Nawanawa Gorge, because it's, it's million-year-old rock. I heard that there was rare callistemons in there, but I needed to hear what the cultural significance it had for our people. And, the elder who talked me through this is now passed, and she only ever told me that story. And the head of Duke Energy came to me and he said, I need to know what the story is of that gorge, Lydia. Why don't you tell me? And I said, it's not for me to tell you. It's my elders. My elders have to tell you that. I can't give you that information. And he said, oh, elders. And he was very disrespectful. He ended up getting quite sick and having to go back to America. And it's the only bend in the pipe from Longford to Sydney, because we weren't allowing, explosives to go through this million-year-old rock and destroy the significance. But it was a whole community that came together. Like, I set up a little campfire, and we had non-Aboriginal elders come sit around bringing warm, freshly cooked cakes and coffee. And it was just a beautiful moment of a whole community coming together and for different reasons, right? So the white fellas of the town had their reasons, and the black fellas, the traditional owners, had their reasons, but we connected for all of those reasons and we won. So I think taking the time, and it does take time to connect, because we've got to build trust with people. And that's what we did in that example. And I think that's what we need to continue to do. Just sit down, have a yarn, take the time to understand and learn, and we can win. We can win. Jabiluka is another example. There's excellent examples around this country where black and white people have come together, shared the story of why they care about the area, and we've won as a result. And governments have also kept the environment and climate groups away from traditional owners, and we need to connect the movements together.
Yeah, great. And that's that was a great example of what can be achieved. Well, Lydia, would you talk about the Sacred Red Gums, another campaign that you've been involved in? Was there similar community involvement there, or was it very much because it's a sacred women's space? Was that a sort of a women's fight?
It was women-led, particularly by our matriarchs, the Djapurrung matriarchs. So they were the decision makers, and we had to seek permission from them to campaign and do what we did on Djapurrung country. But everyone was welcome, and I think why that was so successful was pretty much what story I just gave you. People came and sat around the fire and had a cup of tea, and it took days, weeks for those yarns to happen, but people just connected in a way that they hadn't connected before. I'm talking about non-Aboriginal people, because they were able to have those yarns and learn more deeply about the area. Where we're at, I mean, we're still fighting that. My mum's on the court case as a signature, and she's fighting it every day. So, they want to build that road in the middle of talking about a treaty. The Victorian government want a treaty with us, but they want to destroy our 800-year-old birthing trees, and they want to frack the country, and they want to continue to log. That's not a treaty. Can I just say that is not a treaty?
Feminism has a different look for all of us, maybe today. Activism too for the environment, probably different for different people. Alice, you've written a bit about the impact of being a parent at this time. Facing climatic disaster. You've written these apocalyptic novels, and now we're kind of living one. Can you talk a bit about, your views on being a parent at this time and how that's informed your activism?
It's another point of unsettlement, different things flowing into the same place from different directions or different feelings, different ideas. And what I mean by that is that I had children after already being pretty engaged in the climate space. But it was like, even though I knew that those things were true about what was probably going to happen in the future, and that there was no doubt in my mind that it was actual, I also chose to have children, which, the two decisions seem kind of counterintuitive, and yet they sit alongside one another. And often because of the nature of my work, I've been asked to explain that decision or to unpack it. And I feel that on some level I can't really. Like, one of them is a decision of the head and the other one's a decision of the heart. But also having the children is such a profoundly hopeful thing to do. It sort of goes against rational thought. But you're left with this kind of sense of sending the people that you love most into a future that you fear will be disastrous. And yet it also, by having them, gets you in the game in a pretty serious way, because of course I don't want my children to suffer. I don't want anyone's children to suffer, and I don't think there's any accident that when you go to these big marches in Melbourne, where I live, for the climate, it's just packed with people with prams. So there's something very galvanizing, especially for mothers, potentially about having a child, having some flesh in the game in a serious way about what's going to happen next. So, I'm interested in that conundrum, and I'm interested in talking to people for whom having children has been taken off the table because they're fearful about what's going to happen next. And I'm interested in people who make the opposite choice as well, like I did. And the interesting thing to me about this moment in history, when we're having this conversation, is that the kind of precursor disaster, if you like, of this pandemic has been really soothing and kind of comforting to me, in the sense that, the entire society hasn't collapsed. A big, profound thing has happened. And whether or not we agree with the kinds of mandates, government mandates around keeping people safe and things, we're still here. And perhaps there are going to be some positive outcomes in the way you're just describing, about the perspective that it's given some parts of our community and certainly me on the way that we were living. I said to a friend at the start of the year, I'm just so busy, I often feel like I can't breathe. And I said that in a very casual way, like, we were just catching up, and that's not an okay way to be living. But it was so normalized to me. And it took a global pandemic to make me think, maybe there's another way.
Yeah. Well, the way we were living was unsustainable on so many levels, right? There's hopes and lessons I learned from that.
I suppose it's different for Aboriginal people in that, we're born into injustice, we're born into struggle, and we've always had to fight, right? We've had to fight to keep our children safe, and we've had to fight racism, we've had to fight the oppression, So that's not anything new to us, having to fight, you know, this climate injustice that's going on. And it's, you know, it's new for a lot of people in this country to band together and fight for climate justice. But we've been fighting for Black justice for 240 years. And it's like where's everyone been, you know? So I just think that it's something that I'd like people to consider, is that we've been fighting a bloody long time. And if we had have had justice 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, then maybe we wouldn't be in this climate crisis in this country, because we would have had more say over our land, and we would have been able to protect it and preserve it for all of our generations into the future. So I think, you know, our first struggle is to survive as First People, and then we talk about climate, because we've got to survive to be able to fight the climate.
Yeah. Can I ask each of you for something that you feel positive about going forward? I mean, it's easy to get overwhelmed at the moment, right? How do you keep going, each of you?
I feel really hopeful. Maybe this is also a bit problematic, but I feel quite hopeful about the extent to which young people are really picking up this fight. I know that they feel that there's an injustice in that also, that previous generations haven't done anything and now are really congratulatory that they are doing something. But that just gives me a lot of hope. And even just thinking about this conversation today has been really galvanizing and exciting. You know, that these things are being talked about and taken seriously. And I think there's a lot to be really hopeful about, or at least I find it meaningful to think so.
I have to be hopeful. Otherwise, what do? We lay down and die and give up. That's not in my blood. And I believe, and this might seem a bit crazy for people who, you know, aren't First People, but I believe our ancestors are in control here. And when we have extreme weather events, you know, we see the land as our mother, we see the earth as our mother, and when we have those events, you know, I feel the pain of my mother. I feel that she's angry and that she's crying for help. And so I'm guided by my ancestors. I don't know how the hell I ended up a senator in the federal parliament. I believe that the ancestors made that happen. They made it happen in Victoria whilst there was a treaty conversation going on. And I think they were part of me not being successful in that state election, so that I had this opportunity to go a bit higher at the most crucial time in our history in this country. So I'm hopeful. I'm also hopeful about our young people having a stronger voice. And I'm hopeful about bringing this nation together like it's never been before. And so I think that our future is bright, that we're going to feel some pain, that we're going to hurt. But I think, how else do people wake up and learn that this is bloody serious? I think when they feel that pain and that hurt that we've felt for 240 years, that people will wake up, and I'm seeing that now. So I'm hopeful. I think that we'll have a brand new nation where we can have a flag that we agree on, that we have an anthem that we can agree on, that we have a day of celebration that we can agree on, and that from, you know, successfully getting to those points in our life and in our nation, that climate justice will happen as a result of that also, because it'll be part of the conversation around truth-telling.
Wow. Thank you so much for your strength and optimism and the vision. Just hearing such a beautifully verbalised and empowered vision for this country gives me a lot of heart. So thank you. Thank you.
I was just going to say that I'm so excited to see what happens next. Lidia, I'm so glad you're in the position that you're in. It's really exciting.
Well, I was on a private jet last night, which was weird. Here I am with my Black Lives Matter mask and, you know, real cash. And Josh Frydenberg comes along and we had a great yarn, and it was just him and I as the politicians on this private jet. And he was really lovely. So I want to talk to people who don't agree with me. I want to have these yarns with Pauline Hanson. I want to have these yarns with as many politicians as I can. You know, there's ways that we can connect where people don't even realise that we have things in common.
I love it. You've got a great attitude. It's great. We're in good hands, Senator. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Our thanks to the speakers and chair, our podcast partner Listen Up Podcasting, and the Besen Family Foundation for vital funding support. We acknowledge that this recording took place across Australia on First Nations lands whose sovereignty has never been ceded. For more FWF goodness, visit our website, feministwritersfestival.com, and find us on socials.
Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to Climactic, the flagship podcast of the Climactic Collective, a podcast network dedicated to lifting the voices of the climate community. You can find out more about the people of the Climactic Collective and all the shows on the network at climactic.com.au. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep up the great work and take care of each other in these climactic times.
The Climactic Collective.